More than 5,000 years ago, when the world's great civilizations were just beginning to rise, one man stood at the crossroads of chaos and destiny. Egypt was divided, torn between the fertile delta of the north and the sun-scorched cliffs of the south. Rival kings fought for supremacy, blood was spilled across the Nile, and unity seemed impossible. But then came a leader whose vision stretched beyond tribes and borders, a warrior who would take two crowns and forge one kingdom. His name was Narmer. He was not just a conqueror, he was the architect of a civilization that would outlast empires, kings, and time itself. This is the story of the first pharaoh, the man who turned division into destiny. The desert sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the skies of ancient Egypt in strokes of gold and crimson. Below, the Nile River snaked its way through the land, its waters shimmering in the morning light, carrying both life and mystery. For the people who lived on its banks, the Nile was not just a river. It was their lifeblood, their guardian, their god. Its yearly floods brought rich black silt, turning the parched desert into fertile farmland. Without it, Egypt would have been nothing but sand. With it, Egypt became a land of promise. But in this early dawn of history, Egypt was not a single kingdom. It was two lands, two crowns, two peoples. To the north lay Lower Egypt, the delta region where the Nile fanned into a vast web of channels before spilling into the Mediterranean. This was a land of abundance. Fish swam in its marshes, papyrus reeds grew tall and strong, and traders came by boat from distant shores. Its rulers wore the red crown, a tall headpiece with a curved protrusion in the front, a symbol as bold as the land itself. To the south stretched Upper Egypt, a harsher world where the Nile flowed between cliffs of stone and barren desert. Here, survival was harder. The sun blazed hotter, the soil was thinner, and the people carved their lives out of the unforgiving land. Yet they were resilient, proud, and hardened by struggle. Their kings wore the white crown, a tall, conical headdress, stark against the blue of the sky. Upper and Lower Egypt were bound together by the same river, but divided by centuries of rivalry. Each had its gods, its traditions, its rulers who claimed divine authority. Kings of the north boasted of their wealth, kings of the south of their strength. Armies clashed along the river's edge. Alliances formed, only to crumble in betrayal. The people never knew whose banners would fly above their villages. The falcon of Horus from the south, or the bee of the north. Egypt was one land in geography, but two lands in spirit. And yet, beneath this division, there was something deeper, a shared identity waiting to be born. The Nile did not respect borders. It flowed as one. Every flood, every harvest, every prayer whispered to the gods tied Egyptians together. Farmers in the delta and farmers in the valley both bent their backs under the same sun. Priests in the north and priests in the south both lifted their arms to the heavens, seeking the same blessings. Traders and craftsmen, hunters and fishermen, mothers and children, they all lived in a rhythm shaped by the river. It was this unity of life, hidden beneath the rivalry of kings, that awaited a leader strong enough to seize it. Someone who could bind the two lands not only with the sword, but with an idea that Egypt was not two peoples, but one. That leader would come in the form of a man named Narmer. We know little of his childhood, his birth, his family, the first years of his life. All of it lies buried under the sands of time. But his deeds carved his name into eternity. What we do know is this: Narmer rose from Upper Egypt, a man of vision and determination. He inherited the white crown, but he hungered for more. To him, the red crown of Lower Egypt was not an enemy's headdress. It was the missing half of destiny. Narmer was not the first to dream of uniting the two lands. For generations, kings before him had tried, only to falter. Some won battles but lost the peace. Others conquered cities but failed to inspire loyalty. Unity always slipped through their fingers. But Narmer was different. He saw that power was not just in armies. It was in symbols, in belief, in the will of the people to see their ruler as more than a man. Imagine Egypt in Narmer's time. Mud brick houses clustered along the riverbanks, farmers sowing grain in the rich black soil left by the floods, fishermen casting nets into the reeds, children splashing in the shallows of the Nile, priests chanting in temples of wood and stone, offering incense to gods like Horus, Hathor, and Ra. Life seemed ordinary, and yet, just beyond the horizon, armies gathered, kings plotted, battles loomed. The future of Egypt stood on the edge of change. The story of Narmer is not merely the story of one man's ambition. It is the story of the birth of kingship itself, the invention of the pharaoh. It is the story of war, yes, but also of faith and vision, of betrayal and loyalty, of a dream that became so powerful, it shaped history for 3,000 years. When Narmer rose, Egypt was two. When he fell, Egypt was one. And that unity, fragile and bloody as it was, became the foundation of one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. In the rugged lands of Upper Egypt, where the Nile narrowed between cliffs and desert, a young ruler named Narmer began to make his mark. He had inherited a kingdom where survival meant strength, where the people had long lived under the shadow of scarcity. The men of Upper Egypt were hardened by the harshness of the land, trained early in both farming and fighting. They respected leaders who could provide grain, protect their villages, and lead them in war. Narmer was such a leader, but he was more than that. He was a visionary. Unlike rulers content to defend their borders, Narmer looked north toward the delta, toward the wealthy lands of Lower Egypt. To him, the red crown was not a symbol of a rival, but the missing half of his destiny. He believed the gods had chosen him to unite the two lands. His claim was not only political, it was spiritual. Narmer presented himself as the guardian of Maat, the principle of order, truth, and balance that held the universe together. Without unity, Egypt was chaos. With unity, Egypt would thrive. But belief alone could not win him a throne. Narmer needed strength, armies to fight, allies to support him, priests to legitimize his claim. He began forging alliances with the smaller chieftains of Upper Egypt, binding them under his leadership. To those who bent the knee, he offered protection, fertile land, and a share in the spoils of conquest. To those who resisted, he unleashed swift punishment. Each victory added to his authority. Each act of mercy or brutality was carefully calculated to strengthen his position. Narmer was not only a warrior, he was a master of symbols. He understood that power was not just about swords and spears, but about how people saw their ruler. He wore the white crown of Upper Egypt proudly, but he made sure his image carried weight beyond his presence. On walls, ivory tags, and ceremonial objects, Narmer was depicted larger than life, smiting his enemies, standing above them as a god on earth. These were not merely decorations. They were messages to his people. Narmer was destined for greatness. The most famous of these is the Narmer palette, a carved stone slab that has survived 5 millennia. On one side, Narmer is shown holding a defeated enemy by the hair, about to strike with his mace. On the other, he wears both crowns, the white of Upper Egypt and the red of Lower Egypt. It is not just art. It is propaganda, announcing Narmer as the unifier of the two lands. For his people, this was not imagination. It was truth made visible in stone. Still, Narmer's rise was not without struggle. Rivals lurked everywhere. Other kings who dreamed of unity, warlords who feared losing their autonomy, priests who questioned his divine claim. He had to be both patient and ruthless, building his power piece by piece. He marched into towns, negotiated with leaders, married strategically to bind families to his cause. Through cunning, he expanded his reach until most of Upper Egypt acknowledged him as supreme. As Narmer's influence grew, so too did his sense of destiny. He saw himself not only as a king of men, but as chosen by Horus, the falcon god, to rule the world. His followers began to echo this belief, calling him the earthly vessel of divine will. To them, Narmer's victories were not just military, they were proof that the gods favored him. But the greatest challenge lay ahead. Lower Egypt, with its wealth and fertile fields, would not simply hand over the red crown. Its rulers saw Narmer as an invader, a conqueror from the south. To claim their land, Narmer would need to do more than fight. He would need to redefine kingship itself. Narmer prepared carefully. He gathered armies trained for long campaigns, warriors who could march across miles of desert and fight in the marshes of the delta. He stockpiled grain to feed his men, forged weapons from copper and flint, and built boats to carry his soldiers down the Nile. But he also prepared his people spiritually. He reminded them that uniting Egypt was not just for him, but for them, for prosperity, for peace, for the blessing of the gods. Imagine Narmer standing before his warriors, the white crown gleaming in the sun, his voice rising above the clatter of shields. The gods have chosen us. Horus himself flies above our banners. The Nile does not flow for two kingdoms, it flows for one. And under my crown we will be one people, one Egypt. The soldiers roared in approval. Farmers, craftsmen, and priests alike began to see Narmer not just as their ruler, but as the embodiment of a dream long whispered along the Nile. A dream of unity. A dream of power. By the time Narmer finally set his eyes on Lower Egypt, he was no longer just a king of the south. He was the man destined to shape history. His name would be carved into eternity, and the wars that followed would change the world forever. When Narmer first tightened his grip on the double crown, he knew his throne was not made of stone, but of fragile agreements, uneasy allegiances, and simmering rivalries. Egypt was united in name, but unity was a newborn child, delicate, untested, and surrounded by dangers that could crush it before it learned to walk. The fertile Nile Valley had always been home to ambitious chieftains, each with their own loyalty to clan, to region, to ancient gods that were older than the idea of a single Egypt. Narmer's dream of a unified kingdom was bold, but boldness alone did not quiet restless warlords. It would take the iron weight of conflict. In the delta of Lower Egypt, where reeds grew tall and crocodiles slipped silently through the waters, local chiefs still whispered that the southern king was a usurper. To them, Narmer was an intruder from the rocky cliffs of Upper Egypt, a man who had taken their crown by force, not by right. Narmer understood these whispers for what they were: sparks waiting to become flame. He had no choice but to smother them with military might. The first campaigns of Narmer's reign became etched in stone, not merely as stories, but as warnings to those who defied him. On the famous Narmer palette, an artifact carved with astonishing detail, he is shown towering over a kneeling enemy, about to strike with his mace. His crown shifts between the tall white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, a clear message that he wore both, not as a pretender, but as a sovereign ordained by the gods. To his people, these images were more than art. They were propaganda, an ancient form of psychological warfare. Every stroke of the chisel declared that Narmer was not just a king, but the rightful ruler of both lands, destined to bring order from chaos. But wars were not fought on stone. They were fought on the ground, where soldiers, barefoot and armed with copper, tipped spears, marched under the blazing sun. Narmer's army was disciplined, unlike the fragmented militias of the northern chiefs. His generals trained them to fight in formation, to use the Nile not only as a source of life, but as a corridor of conquest. Boats lined with shields carried warriors swiftly downstream, striking settlements before the rebels could gather strength. Each campaign ended with captives taken, lands seized, and symbols of rebellion torn down. Still, unification was never clean. In the marshlands, rebellions sprang up like stubborn weeds. Every season brought new uprisings, and every uprising demanded blood. Narmer's scribes, who recorded victories in temples, left out the screams of villages burned, the hunger that followed, and the fear of those caught between loyalty to their old chiefs and survival under a new king. The cost of unity was high, and Narmer bore it heavily. He was not merely a conqueror, he was a man building a nation from fragments. His conflicts were not limited to enemies within. To the east, across the desert sands, trade routes ran toward the Sinai and beyond, carrying copper and precious stones. Control of these routes meant wealth, and wealth meant power. Tribes who lived near these routes resisted Egyptian expansion. Narmer sent his armies across the deserts, where heat could kill faster than a spear. Victories were hard won, but each secured path brought Egypt closer to prosperity. It is in this period that we see Narmer's brilliance, not only as a warrior, but as a strategist. He did not fight merely to destroy. He fought to absorb, to transform enemies into subjects, rebels into citizens, conquered lands into parts of a greater Egypt. When cities were taken, their gods were honored alongside Egypt's own, their festivals woven into the rhythm of the Nile's seasons. Narmer understood that power built only on fear was brittle. Power built on fear and faith together, that was unshakable. And yet, beneath the triumphs, the conflict left scars. Entire communities carried bitterness for generations. Some northern Egyptians never fully forgave the domination of the south. Songs of resistance whispered in taverns and homes long after Narmer's victories. The memory of men crushed under his chariots became folklore, passed down by those who had seen their sons fall. Even as Narmer celebrated victories in grand ceremonies, shadows lingered. He knew that unity could not be cemented by the sword alone. So, alongside campaigns of war, Narmer launched campaigns of culture. He reinforced the divine justification of his rule, linking himself with Horus, the falcon god of the sky. Temples rose in both Upper and Lower Egypt, inscribed with prayers that depicted Narmer as chosen by the gods to maintain Mat, the sacred balance of order and harmony. Priests, loyal to him, spread this message in every village. For those who had lost family in his wars, faith was a balm. For Narmer, it was another weapon, more enduring than copper and stone. The conflicts of Narmer's reign were not just military struggles. They were the crucible in which Egypt was forged. Every battle, every rebellion crushed, every temple razed, chipped away at the divisions of the past. Slowly, painfully, the image of two Egypts faded, replaced by the vision of one kingdom under one pharaoh. And yet, beneath the crown, Narmer remained a man. One can imagine him standing at the edge of the Nile at dusk, looking at the red, stained waters after a battle, wondering if his dream of unity was worth the blood it demanded. History remembers him as a victor, but behind the victories lay the cost of conflict. The weight of a nation built on bones and belief. A nation that would endure for 3,000 years because one man chose to bear it. The glory of Narmer's reign was not without shadows. As much as his victories over rival chieftains had won him respect, they also planted the seeds of resentment. Egypt, though united under his crown, was still a fragile experiment. For centuries, the lands of the Nile had been divided. Upper Egypt to the south, with its desert cliffs and proud warrior chiefs, and Lower Egypt to the north, with its fertile delta and trade connections. Narmer had bound them together through conquest, but unity forged by force is always tested by betrayal. At first, the unrest came quietly. Whispers moved among local leaders who had bent the knee reluctantly. They still carried the pride of their lineages, and to them, Narmer was a usurper from another land. These whispers turned into murmurs of revolt. In the marshes of the Delta, far from Narmer's southern stronghold at Hierakonpolis, old loyalties remained alive. Chiefs who had once ruled independently began plotting, their loyalty to Narmer's new kingdom more practical than heartfelt. They spoke to one another in hidden councils, asking, why should the lands of the north bow forever to a man from the south? The first true act of betrayal struck, like a knife in the dark. One of Narmer's appointed governors, trusted to maintain order in Lower Egypt, secretly sided with local rebels. He opened city gates at night, allowing armed bands to take control before Narmer's loyal soldiers even realized the threat. Fires lit up the night sky, symbols of Narmer's authority. His seals, his banners, his officials, were torn down and trampled. What had been Narmer's grand dream of a single, stable Egypt seemed suddenly fragile. When word reached Narmer, his reaction was swift and merciless. He gathered his generals, the men who had marched with him when he first crushed the rival kings. He reminded them of what was at stake, not just their power, but the very survival of Egypt as a united land. If rebellion spread unchecked, the Nile would again descend into the chaos of competing rulers, the bloodshed of endless civil war. Narmer would not allow it. The counter-strikes were brutal. Narmer's armies advanced north again, this time not as conquerors but as enforcers. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned. Chiefs who refused loyalty were dragged before him in chains. The punishment was harsh, some were executed, their bodies displayed as warnings, while others were publicly humiliated, forced to swear oaths of loyalty in front of their people. Narmer made sure the consequences of rebellion were etched into memory. Yet even as he crushed these uprisings, the betrayals cut deeper than any blade. Narmer was no fool. He knew he could not rule forever through fear alone. For every rebel destroyed, new grievances were born. He began to realize that if his dream of a unified Egypt were to endure, he needed more than soldiers and executions. He needed symbols that spoke to both Upper and Lower Egypt, symbols that could turn reluctant subjects into proud Egyptians. This realization gave birth to one of his most lasting legacies, the double crown. It was a masterpiece of symbolism. The white crown of Upper Egypt, tall and conical, and the red crown of Lower Egypt, flat and broad, were combined into a single headdress. When Narmer placed this crown upon his head, He was not just a king from the south ruling the north by force. He was the Pharaoh of all Egypt, wearing both lands in harmony. In ceremonies and festivals, when people saw him crowned, they saw not a conqueror, but a ruler who embodied both of their heritages. Still, the shadow of betrayal lingered. Narmer's rule was a constant balancing act, tightening his grip with one hand while extending an olive branch with the other. He placed loyal family members in key positions, but also married into northern noble families to secure alliances. He ordered the building of temples, not just in his southern strongholds, but in the delta as well, showing that the gods of Lower Egypt, too, had a place in his kingdom. For Narmer himself, the betrayals weighed heavily. To his closest advisors, he sometimes confided that victory on the battlefield was easier than ruling over men's hearts. It is said he once remarked, "I can cut off the head of a rebel in a day, but how do I cut off the thoughts of rebellion from the minds of his sons?" It was this insight that shaped his later years, pushing him to blend might with myth, punishment with pageantry. The rebellions were never fully extinguished during Narmer's reign, but they did not undo his kingdom either. By the end of his rule, he had beaten back enough conspiracies to prove that Egypt's unity was not so easily broken. His harsh measures may have earned him enemies, but they also carved out a sense of inevitability Egypt would remain one. Betrayal, then, was not just a challenge Narmer faced. It was a crucible that forced him to refine what it meant to be pharaoh. He learned that power was not only about the sword, but also about symbols, marriages, rituals, and the slow weaving of loyalty across generations. Without the rebellions, he might have ruled only as a conqueror. With them, he became a statesman, a ruler who understood that Egypt's unity had to be written into the hearts of its people, not just carved into stone. And so, from betrayal came wisdom, and from wisdom came resilience. Egypt endured, not in spite of the betrayals, but because Narmer transformed them into opportunities to bind his kingdom tighter. It was a dangerous game, but one he played well enough to leave Egypt standing united after his death. The story of Narmer does not end with his reign, nor with the crown that rested on his head. His true legacy lies in the nation he shaped, Egypt. To understand what Narmer left behind, one must imagine Egypt before him, two divided lands, bound together by the Nile, but separated by culture, custom, and rivalry. After him, however, Egypt stood as a singular force, a kingdom that would endure for millennia. This transformation is why historians call Narmer the father of pharaonic Egypt. Narmer's greatest achievement was unity, but not simply the kind written in chronicles. It was a unity etched into the daily lives of his people. Farmers in the delta who once traded only among their neighbors now saw their grain carried southward, through canals and riverboats, feeding cities hundreds of miles away. Craftsmen of Upper Egypt, who once worked only for local lords, now carved stone pallets that symbolized the entire kingdom. His unification gave birth to the first sense of Egyptian identity, not just a tribe, not just a region, but a civilization. In his capital, Memphis, Narmer's court became the beating heart of this new order. Strategically placed where Upper and Lower Egypt met, Memphis was more than a seat of power. It was a bridge between cultures. Here, priests from the Delta stood alongside scribes from the south, all working to codify rituals and record the will of the king. Trade flourished as caravans from Nubia brought gold and ivory, while merchants from the Levant brought cedar and lapis lazuli. Egypt was no longer isolated pockets of power. It was one body, and Narmer had given it a pulse. But Narmer's legacy was not only political, it was symbolic. He laid the foundation for the divine kingship that would define Egyptian rule for 3,000 years. By wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, Narmer did more than display conquest. He created a lasting symbol, the double crown, the eternal sign of a united land. From then on, every pharaoh would wear it, not just to rule, but to embody Egypt itself. This idea, that the pharaoh was not merely a man, but the earthly vessel of divine order, or mat, was perhaps Narmer's most enduring contribution. He was the first to bridge the fragile line between human authority and divine mandate. His people began to see him not as a warlord or tribal leader, but as a living God who maintained balance between chaos and harmony. This concept would shape Egyptian religion, art, and governance for centuries. The temples built under his successors still echoed with the notion that the king was the guarantor of cosmic order, a seed first planted by Narmer. Yet, no legacy is without its shadows. The rebellions that marked his later years prove that unity was not a permanent state, but a struggle to be constantly maintained. Some regions resisted the centralization of power. Local chieftains bristled at being overshadowed by a distant throne in Memphis. Narmer's successors would inherit not just a united Egypt, but also the challenge of keeping it united. The first dynasty, which he founded, would continue this delicate balancing act, strengthening the monarchy while placating local powers. Still, Narmer's name endured. His victory was immortalized on the Narmer Palette, an artifact that remains one of the most important relics of Egyptian history. On it, he is depicted larger than life, smiting enemies with a raised mace, wearing the crowns of both kingdoms. This image was not just a record of conquest. It was propaganda, a visual declaration of his divine right to rule. Thousands of years later, this piece of stone continues to speak, reminding us of the moment Egypt was born. Narmer's tomb in Abydos also testifies to his enduring stature. Buried among the early rulers of Egypt, his resting place is more than a grave. It is a marker of the dawn of a dynasty. Archaeologists who uncovered its remnants found not just bones and pottery, but evidence of a leader who commanded respect in life and reverence in death. His successors returned to Abydos to bury their own dead, as if to anchor their authority in the same sacred soil where Narmer lay. Perhaps the most striking measure of Narmer's legacy is not found in artifacts, but in time itself. The Egypt he united became one of the longest, lasting civilizations in human history. For nearly 3,000 years, pharaohs sat on the throne of Egypt, each one tracing their authority back to the man who first wore the double crown. When Ramses raised temples, when Cleopatra ruled from Alexandria, when Tutankhamun was laid to rest in his golden mask, all of them did so in the shadow of Narmer. His reign was the spark that lit the torch of Egypt's greatness. To humanize his story is to imagine him not just as a king, but as a man who looked out over the Nile and saw more than a river. He saw a lifeline connecting two worlds that could either clash forever or rise together. He chose unity. That choice, made in an age when most of the world still lived in scattered tribes, created a civilization that became the envy of history. So when we speak of Narmer today, we do not merely speak of the first pharaoh. We speak of a visionary, a warrior, and a symbol. His victories on the battlefield secured his crown, but his vision of unity secured his immortality. Egypt, as the world came to know it, was his true creation. And that is why Narmer's name, carved in stone over 5,000 years ago, still whispers across the sands the first king, the unifier, the eternal pharaoh. Narmer's name may be carved into stone, but his true legacy is carved into history itself. By uniting Upper and Lower Egypt, he lit the first spark of a civilization that would shape the world for thousands of years. Every pyramid, every temple, every scroll of wisdom that came after rests on the foundation he built. He was not just the first pharaoh. He was the one who proved that vision and courage could turn chaos into order, tribes into a nation, and fleeting power into eternal legacy. Narmer's footsteps may have faded into the sands of time, but his shadow still stretches across the Nile, reminding us that unity is the greatest power of all.